This last year for Mother's Day, I did something what I thought was creative. I'm normally not the best at creativity, but Mother's Day was coming around. We didn't have a budget for Mother's Day. And so I went to Pinterest and I found this little thing on Pinterest. Guys, if you don't have Pinterest on your phone, let me encourage you. It is a lifesaver. Anyways, so I go to Pinterest and I'm like, Mother's Day gifts on the cheap. How are we going to do this? Because the boys have to do something. And so, anyways, I saw this thing on Pinterest where a person had taken like their kid's hand, cut it out, and put it on little sticks. And so it made like a bouquet of flowers. I thought, oh, I can do that. I can do that. And so I put Elliot, which Elliot could cut and he could trace his own hand. So he could do the whole hand thing. And he was like, his hands were wonky looking, but he would do his hands and he was great with that. Everett couldn't do nothing, but I did his feet and they looked like little tulips by the time they were done. And so I put all of these things together and then they wouldn't stand up because I didn't have sticks. But I ended up putting them on pipe cleaners. And then I put the pipe cleaners through a cheese grater to hold it all up. I know when I say it's wonky, an understatement for this little gift. And I had that set up so that when she came home, that cheese grater with all these little hand and feet prints were sitting there on the table. I outdid it this time. I look at that gift. And that gift, I don't know. I mean, I went and bought construction paper. I bought pipe cleaners. Anyone crafty? How much did I spend? $4, $5, six? Huh? I I could have done it, but I don't know where any of that stuff's at. And I'm not going to take. So it's like I go to the store, I buy it. I spent $6, and that gift. Matter of fact, it's one of the few things that she still has. We don't really keep a lot. It's like some of this stuff, it's like, look, we'll take a picture, we'll remember it later. We're not the type that keep a box full of mementos of every little thing that the kids have done. And so it's like we took a picture, but this is one of those items that Ashley still holds on to. And I realize that when we talk about next steps, we talk about things that move people closer to God. Last week, we spent time talking about how it's important to be here. It's important to be with other people who are of like faith, who are of like belief. It is important to value church. Church matters. But this week, what I want us to think on is the importance of heartfelt generosity. When we talk about next steps, what does it take to grow closer to God? I'm going to say that our pocketbook also determines where our hearts are. If church matters is the dictation of our time, where our time is spent, then our pocketbook is also an indicator of our life and what's important to us. And there's a story in Genesis chapter 4 about a guy's pocketbook that really hurts. It's a story that's very puzzling to me. And so I want us to go through the story together today because I think it's one thing that maybe by the time we're finished, we'll have a better understanding. But in Genesis chapter 4, there's the story of Cain and the offering that he gave to God. And so when I look at the story of Cain in chapter 4, and by the way, chapter 4 is Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel. Spoiler alert, if you didn't know. But I don't want to focus so much on Cain's vengeance as much as I want to speak on the offering, the gift that he gave. And so when we look at Genesis chapter 4, what I'm coming into it and I'm looking is he is told to bring an offering, or whether he is told to or whether he chooses to freely, we're not really given those details. There are other things going on in the book of Genesis that we don't know. Like how did they know a sacrificial system? That we're not told that. But somehow along the way, they knew that. And I just have to trust that that's not written for me to know. And so Cain brings a gift to God, verse 2. Cain and Abel both do. But what I notice and what is troubling is that God, my translation says, does not regard his offering as acceptable, doesn't accept his gift. I think, what's it like to bring a gift to somebody and have them reject it? What's it like to bring something to someone who you respect, you love, you value, and for them to say, that's not what I wanted. I don't really like that. What's it like when that's your God who you've done that? And his response is, I don't want that. The story continues that Cain becomes jealous of his brother Abel, whose sacrifice was accepted, whose offering was accepted. And for the rest of the biblical story, Cain is the bad guy. You can go from Cain and Abel in Genesis 4 to the Kenites, which would be the after in the Old Testament period when they're trying to conquer the land. And then you're going to go all the way through to the book of Hebrews, to 1 John, where we are continually told, continually reminded that Cain was the harbinger of evil, that he was the essence of what's wrong. And here's a guy who's bringing something to God. That struggles for me. It's a puzzle. Let's read the text together and then let's spend some time thinking about it. Genesis chapter 4, verse 2. Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. And in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. When the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were out in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the text would continue to say that Abel's blood cried out to God. I read that passage and it is a struggle for me because I put myself into Cain's shoes and I ask the question, what's it like to give and to not be accepted? What's it like to sacrifice? What's it like to do something? And for my gift to be to someone who I would adore, to someone who is my God, and for that person to look at me and say, that's not what I wanted. Well, I can tell you sometimes I have a young little boy who will sometimes say, well, that's not what I wanted. You know, I didn't want chicken enchilada for dinner. I wanted chicken nuggets. Well, you know, I'm at the age and the position to say, tough. That's what's for dinner. But what's it like when it's a relationship between a person and the divine? What's that like? I start off by asking, why did God not find the sacrifice appealing? Like what's going on here? We're not given a lot of details, so we're going to have to read some of this into it. But what's really going on here? And I've heard people talk like I remember a sermon years ago, and the preacher said something along these lines where he said the problem is that Cain brought vegetables and God is a carnivore. You know, that was the idea. And it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. You know, later on, we know the sacrificial system, God likes meat. Well, we know that, but that doesn't answer the question here because it's not called a sacrifice. It's called an offering, a gift. That's the other word for offering. So it's a free will gift. And by the way, God accepted non-meat gifts. So that's not really the example that's best to be used here. That's not the full context of what's going on. I look and I say, well, there are some ideas that would say that maybe Cain was a bad guy. Maybe he had some evil intention within him, some evil going on deep inside. And he hadn't truly made resolve for those issues. So when he made his gift, there was evil inside of him. This idea comes really when you're looking at, say, verses 6 and 7. God says, why are you angry? Your face is downcast. If you don't do what's right, surely if you do what's right, won't you be blessed? Like there's this understanding in verses 6 and 7 that Abel knows the good way, but is choosing something different. John would say, and this is 1 John chapter 3, verse 11, do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? This is before the actual death. Why did he murder him? John says, because his own actions were evil. So the way 1 John looks at Cain is he says Cain's evil actions were because of an internal struggle, an internal problem, where the evil inside of him, he was jealous of his brother and the fact that his brother was accepted. So I look at that and I say, man, if God doesn't accept the sacrifice because there's something evil inside, how can he accept my sacrifice? I like to pretend that I'm a good person. I like to think that I'm good, but is there not still evil within all of us? Is there not still wrong that dwells within me that I am fighting with? That Paul would say that I'm always in this war with my flesh. If Cain's sacrifice couldn't be accepted because of sin that dwelt within him, I'm up a creek without a paddle. The other idea of why God didn't accept the sacrifice is that Cain's heart wasn't in it. You see, when it talks about the sacrifices here in the Bible, it just says that Cain brought fruit and veggies. That's the Joshua Watkins translation, by the way. But it says that Abel brought the first fruits, the best. He brought the fat. He brought the goods. He brought a ribeye. It's got that nice marbling all the way through it, and it's got the nice cut of fat around it. He brought the ribeye. He brought the best portion. And when you step back and you say, what is Cain and Abel offering? Well, Cain is just giving because of an obligation, because he feels, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. Where Abel is the one who is saying, let me give the first. Let me give the best. And let me, in giving my best, let me trust that God is going to take care of me. Let me enter into his trust and into his faith. Hebrews gives us this. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 4. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offspring. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. There was something internal to Abel that made his sacrifice pleasing. So here's where I come to now. Cain and Abel, that story of offering, of gift, is not a story about what they gave, so much as about how they gave it. And you notice that Abel gave with his heart. He gave with all that he was. He gave from right here. And if you give God your heart, everything else is going to follow. Abel gave in this sense of faith. He gave the first fruits. And in giving the first fruits, he is fully relying on what God is going to do. When you take, let's say you have a whole bunch of goats. Okay, you have a whole bunch of goats. Anyone a goat? None of y'all are goat farmer, herdsman, are you? Okay, good. We got a whole bunch of goats. Well, goats have their babies in, say, the springtime, they drop. And then what happens, what's supposed to happen in a good business model is you're going to want those goats to grow up. You're going to want them to be, you're going to want them to grow up, because hopefully those first goats are then going to be your money for the rest of the year. And what Abel did was he took his first set of goats and he said, I'm going to give these to God. What happens if God doesn't give me any more goats? Well, I guess I'd go without. But that's what the first fruit means, is that we give from the very beginning because we're trusting that God will take care of us, that there's going to be more. If it's a fruit offering, if it's something like that, then we would give. And guess what? If I had a whole bunch of tomatoes and I gave all my tomatoes away, where's my seeds at? Well, I gave them away too, because that was supposed to be my future crop. But they're entering into a place of trust with God. And so I'm saying that what Abel and Cain's difference is that Abel's heart was there. And he said, I'm going to give God everything because my heart's already there. If you give God your heart, everything else will follow. And that's the hardest part for me, is giving God my heart. I like to think that he has my heart and that I just yet to trust him with some of the other stuff. But the truth is that I tend to be the type that worries about the other stuff. And I say, well, oh no, God's got my heart, but I've yet to let my life live up to that. You see what I mean by this is when we start talking about giving, I think I'm often generous like Cain. I probably give more like he did. Well, there's an obligation to it. There's a need, so I'm going to go ahead and take care of that. But I realize there's evil that dwells within me. Jesus would tell us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23, if you got a problem with a brother or sister, you leave your offering at the temple. You don't even give it until you've made things right. And once you've made things right, then you go and you give. Well, there are times where I haven't made things right. There are times where I'm still harboring ill will. There's times where I'm still living in wrong. And I'm going to still say, well, God's going to worry about that later. I'm not going to worry about that. I also find that I give for my remainder instead of my first fruits. Boy, it's, the end of the pay period. Money's getting tight. We're going to decrease this giving a little bit because I don't know if we're going to make it. Instead of giving on the front end. I love online giving, by the way. I've done it for years. But I'll tell you this problem I have with it is if I don't think about it, have I given with my heart? I'm a big online giving fan. But I should set aside in my heart what I'm doing before I ever do it online. We were talking this past Wednesday night. I think it was Kevin, Russell, and myself about this idea of, if you took the offering after the sermon, would people write checks based upon the sermon? It's like, well, he didn't do as well, so we're going to write a lower check, or he did really good, so we're going to write a bigger check. And we were kind of joking around about that, but we got to talking and realized most everyone shows up with their check already made out. Ain't a one of you really going to, you have a set number you've thought about, like this is the number you've prayed about. I hope it's the number you've prayed about. I hope it's the number that you have said, this is what I'm giving. You're not, and most of you, by the time we've gotten here, we're not thinking about it. Unless I remember back in the day when we did pass plates, Jackie, I remember the people who would forget. You would frantically see the ladies grabbing through their purse, and you would hear that sound of the check ripping out. Yeah. You could hear that check sound so normally there's always a couple of folks who are like, oh, they're scribbling real quick. So most people have thought about it well ahead of time. But do we give with our hearts? I'm going to speak about my son for a moment, Elliot. He's a toot most of the time, but I forget what it was. He had some money one time, and he had heard about Honduras. And he had, I think it was like $6 or $7. Ashley may remember, and he said, I want to give money to Honduras. And I said, buddy, you don't have to. Like oh, it was a birthday card. Exactly. And I know it was one of you. I'm not going to say who, but one of you mailed him a birthday card with $6 in it. And he had that birthday card. And he said, I want to give this to Honduras. And I'm like, well, buddy, you don't have to. That's your money. Like you keep it. And he's like, I was like, you give $1, you give $2. He said, I want to give it all. Out of the mouth of babes, is it not? So I realized that when I listened to my son, that a heartless gift is a worthless gift. If I'm not giving from right here, what good is it? It's like that bouquet of flowers. They were $6 of paper and pipe cleaner, but that gift meant far more than the dollar value of its purchase. So what are we going to do about it, church? That's the question. What are we going to do? Well, first off, before I talk about money, I'm going to say you need to give your heart to God. Because you can give all of the money. You could pull your checkbook out. I could hear that rip of the check right now. And you could be writing for however many zeros you want to put on it. And after the decimal could still count. You can write all those zeros you want. But if your heart is not given to God, what good is it? What good is it? Sure, the money's going to do good. I'm sure you can go to some great places. But what good is it if you have sold everything and given to the poor, but you didn't follow Christ? At that point, you're just a poor person who has no hope. And so when I look at this, the first thing I'm going to say, and the thing that you need to walk away with today, is I don't care what you put in the plate. I don't care what you give. I don't care where you give it to. Is your heart given to God? That was Cain's problem. Abel's heart was given to God. And so because of that, he had given to God everything, and God was going to take care of it. He trusted God with it. And that's what made his offering appealing. But friends, if your heart's not given to God, there ain't nothing you can do that's going to make it right. So first, make sure God has your heart. And secondly, give with your heart to God. We don't typically talk about 10%, a tithe, but I'm going to suggest that's a good number. Not that you have to, but everywhere we see in the Old Testament, the tithe is what's talked about. 10%. And I got to thinking about that number, and I listened to a sermon from Rick Atchley sometime this past year, and he made this comment. He said 10% is a drop in the bucket when God has your heart. I thought that's a true statement. If God has my heart, would I not want to give him everything? If my wife asked me for anything, guys, answer this question. If my wife asked me for anything, what are you going to do? I'd move heaven and earth for it. You want the moon? I'm going to lasso a rope around it. I'll pull it down to you. You want something? Because you have my heart, I'm going to move heaven and earth to make sure you have it. If one of your kiddos said, I want or I need this, what are you going to do? You're going to move heaven and earth. I mean, you just say, well, they're a spoiled brat. Well, they might be, but you're going to move heaven and earth to make it happen for them. Because we understand in our relationships that heartless gifts are worthless, and a gift given with the heart means everything. So if God is asking for 10%, man, if he has my heart, 10% is not even enough. I know some of you are going to say, well, Josh, tithe is Old Testament. We don't talk Old Testament. Yeah, you're right. But God deserves 100%. So if we really want to try and match up to what God's doing, there's the challenge. Someone's going to say, well, Josh, I don't know if I can afford 10%. Hey, we're in the same boat. I don't know if I can afford 10%. That's a big number. You start thinking like, how am I going to divide my money out and make this happen? If you're like me, you're accustomed to living a certain way and saying, well, what is 10%? Well, yeah, that starts making it real personal. I say, well, how do you make that happen? And if you're in that boat, this is what I'm going to say. Start with 2%. You heard me. If you can't give 10, start with 2. And if you're given 2, then say, okay, well, could I do 3? Could I do 4? What can I do? And then there's someone out here who's going to say, and I'm ready. This is the final one I'm going to say. There is some person here who says, I made $973 on my Social Security this month. And Josh, I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent, my groceries, my car, my whatever else. Notice in Cain and Abel's offering, it wasn't about giving meat that mattered. It was about giving of the heart. Cain gave of vegetables and fruit because that's who he was. Abel gave of meat because that's who he was. So I'm talking about 10% from an Old Testament perspective, but here's where you really need to take it, is who are you and what has God gifted you with? And are you giving 10% of what God has gifted you with? Some of you here are gifted with money. And if you are gifted with money, then give with money. But some of you here aren't gifted with money. And if that's your case, there is other areas to give. You could give time. Oh, if you said, Josh, I want to give 10% of my time to the Lord, there's enough stuff that we could come up with to be done. There are enough quilts that need to be sewn. There's enough babies that need to be held. There's enough good stuff that could be done. Oh, I could tell you right now, if you wanted to give some of your time, the Sunshine House is always looking for someone to come rock a baby. They're always looking for good people who would come and love on children. You could sit down and read a Bible story to these kids, and they're going to eat it up. That's giving of your time. You could go down to Fern Creek Highview United Ministries. You could go to Muscle. You could go to a soup kitchen. You could give of your time in some powerful ways. You want another way? We have tutoring on Wednesday night. And Chris Phelps has told me multiple times, if I had another person who would sign up to tutor, I could have another kid. If you said, I want to give of my time, there's opportunity for that. So please hear me clearly. I'm going to say 10% because that's a good Bible number. But understand that we are all blessed and gifted differently, and we give in response to our blessings, the way that God has provided for you. We learn heartfelt generosity from Abel because he gave the best and he trusted God with the rest. I don't know what your generosity is going to be. I don't know. Every one of us gives differently, and we should because we give as God has given to us. But I do know this, I could never outgive God. I don't have that ability. Because I could start listing things right now that I would give, and I have yet to give my own son. I've yet to sacrifice to the point where I've given my family. But as I look at the offerings of God and the gifts that he's given to me, like Abel, a righteous man died about 2,000 years ago as an offering in my place. That righteous man being Jesus. And the blood of Abel cried out to God for vengeance. But the blood of Christ cries out for forgiveness. He cries for your forgiveness, and he cries for my forgiveness. And so the ultimate gift that was ever given was that of Christ and him crucified. So today the question becomes not so much about the size of the check that you wrote to put in the offering or the number you put on your app or whatever. The question becomes more so, have you surrendered your heart to God? Have you given him what really matters. And in so doing, everything else will take care of itself. I'm going to invite Mike Williams up to lead us in a prayer. Mike has our application prayer. After this prayer, if there's some way that we can pray with you, walk with you through a journey of faith, come and find me, Mike.
Thanks, Josh, for the message. Would everyone bow your heads? Dear Lord, sometimes we're like Abel and we give you all of us. We give you all of ourselves. Sometimes we're like Cain and we give you part of ourselves. Help us to be more like Abel, but more importantly, help us to be more like you, because you give yourself you give all of yourself to us. And you did that when you gave your son on the cross. So help us in return to give us all of you each day, every day. Teach us how to give, teach us how to love, and teach us how to be righteous like you. In Jesus' name, amen.